Now, I think it's fair to say that in the UK, even in these enlightened times, we're still a little bit hesitant when it comes to talking about sex. In fact, I'll be honest with you, there is a little bit at the back of my head which is thinking, do you remember that Les Dawson character that used to look over the fence? Was it Ada or somebody? And if she ever said anything that was a little bit risque, she wouldn't really say it properly, but would mouth it. And yeah, exactly. Because we don't like to talk about sex, and we don't like to talk about intimacy, do we? And perhaps, particularly, we're not that sure about talking about it in church. And yet, if the intimacy between husband and wife is something that is God-given, as indeed the marriage service says it is, surely we should be able to talk about and explore some of the blessings and some of the issues that can come in getting in the way of nurturing a lifetime's healthy, intimate relationship. There is, after all, to everything a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. And that thought has inspired Emma Waring to write her book, Seasons of Sex and Intimacy, published by our friends at Hello Creative. You can find out more by going to emmawaring.com. And I think it's fair to say, Emma, that I'm right when I say we don't really like talking about sex, do we?
We don't. I think talking about sex is actually really difficult, and I think that's for a number of reasons. Although I think we live in a sexualised society, and actually we're confronted with very sexual images a lot on television, in magazines, in newspapers, in lyrics of songs, etc., films. Actually, we're not very good about talking about sex when it's difficult or it doesn't live up to the ideals that are being portrayed through these media sources. Yeah. So I think the trouble is that, or we do the other thing, which is we joke about sex. A lot of comedy is around, he couldn't get it up, laughing about it, or she's too tired, she's always got a headache. No, but there isn't actually a space for us to be serious and talk about the realities of sex and the fact that actually people aren't having sex as we see it portrayed. And I think the problem is that lots of people make assumptions because we don't talk about it, that other couples are doing things differently, having wonderful sex lives, never having problems, always ready, always wanting to do it. So actually it can be a really lonely place because we don't really know what other people are doing, and we make assumptions and comparisons that can be really unhelpful.
Well, the Reverend Canon J. John, old friend of the programme, of course, says of this book, it's a real pleasure to welcome this wise and intimate book from someone who knows what she's talking about. Many people are going to be very grateful for this. And as I said earlier, it's called Seasons of Sex and Intimacy and written by Emma Waring. And you can find out more about it by going to her website, emmawaring.com. But I note in the blurb that there is around you, Emma, that you are described as a professional sex therapist and a Christian. I bet that raises an eyebrow or two when you're out at a dinner party.
It does. People don't automatically put those two those two in the same sentence, do they?
No.
My background is in nursing, which I think actually for me has been hugely helpful because I'm comfortable talking to people about intimate issues, whether it's sex or how their body's functioning in another way. So that's been really helpful, and I ran a clinic for male cardiac patients suffering with erectile dysfunction, and the two go quite closely hand in hand. And then I realised actually I really needed some additional training in terms of understanding the relational aspect and how to work with couples when they are struggling with an aspect of sex, be it erectile dysfunction or something else. So I did a training, a 2-year postgrad diploma in psychosexual therapy, and that has been wonderfully helpful. And I've combined the two roles. So my title is psychosexual nurse therapist, and I think it's been really helpful being able to combine the medical side of things with the psychological and relational aspect of sex.
And that's what you do in the book, in that you have a chapter that talks about how our bodies work, and you talk about the mechanics of it, and you talk about the physical things that get in the way. But as you say, that idea of talking is also important. And given that we find it hard to talk about intimacy, it's no surprise to me that in fact, the very first chapter you pick up is the importance of communication. Because if couples are going to be able to nurture a lifelong relationship, then conversation about intimacy is as important as anything else.
It is. In fact, I think it's the most important thing. And it was funny when I'd written the first draft of the book, because my editor came back to me and she said, I think the book's great, but I'm a little bit concerned that you've actually only written one paragraph on communication. And I think in a way I had taken for granted that, people do talk about these things. And of course, we don't talk about these things. And actually, it was really important that I went back and I really thought about some of the struggles, and actually, why is it so difficult to talk about this, and what are the things that hold us back? And when I'm asked by people, what would you say is the single most important thing we can do to help our sex life? I always come back to communication. There's no way to avoid it. And I also recognise it's really difficult.
So what is the key thing, do you think, that gets in the way of couples talking about, well, let's be honest, the most private and personal thing between them? The rest of the world has nothing to do with it. It's just them. You would have thought, if there's any way you can be honest and open, it's in that security.
I think it's difficult for a number of reasons. I think it can be, I think our attitude to sex and how we think about sex, and even how we think about our own bodies, will be hugely influenced by the sort of family we grew up in. And when I work with couples, one of the first things I ask them is, tell me about your family history. Tell me about your parents. What sort of environment did you grow up in? Were your parents affectionate with each other? Did your parents talk to you about puberty and sex and where babies came from and those kind of things? And it's really interesting, the spectrum of answers that I get, right from, yes, my parents walked around with no clothes on, they were very comfortable in their own skins, I'm very comfortable in my own skin, they talked about sex openly, right through to sex was never mentioned, I never saw my parents touch. So I think you've got two people bringing in very different histories, if you like, or often very different histories. And I think the other reason that it's difficult is because we are sharing, as you said, there's a sort of innermost part, really. We have to make ourselves vulnerable in order to have really effective communication. And that takes courage, because we don't know how that's going to be received. And again, if somebody's grown up in a family with a very critical parent, where they could never get anything right, what they may have learnt is actually it's better to say nothing. It's better to keep quiet, because whenever I say something, or whenever I put an idea forward, I try something, I never get it right. So I think it's a combination of different factors. Yeah. And I think that the best starting point for a couple is to acknowledge what's going on for them internally. So if it's excruciatingly embarrassing, I think it can be really, really liberating to say, this is so uncomfortable for me, I can't actually even look at you while I speak about this. It takes me back to a really young place of feeling shamed about something I said or something I did, and actually to try and link back with what this is making you feel in that moment can actually be the watershed, because the other partner can say, gosh, I'm amazed. I never expected you to feel so anxious. You're so confident when we're out and about or when you're at work. And I had no idea this was such a sensitive topic for you. So it can just expressing your vulnerability about talking about the subject in itself can be a wonderful sort of launching pad into more intimacy around this topic.
And I would imagine as well that you mentioned earlier on, we live in a very sexualized world. There are a lot of images around us all the time, from the sort of billboard magazine ad type thing to stuff that's in even mainstream films and TV programs. The sort of the media portrayal of sex and intimacy, that's bound to have an impact as well. Even if somebody's not, and I know you've got a chapter in the book about the dangers of pornography, but even if they're not going down that road, just the sort of standard run-of-the-mill things you can see on the telly on a Sunday night can have that sort of impact.
Yes, definitely. And the problem is we're rarely shown situations where sex doesn't quite work, or one person doesn't want it, or the man loses his erection, or it's really painful for the woman. It was unusual the other day. I was watching a film over Christmas, and there was a scene between a husband and wife, and they were in bed together, and they went to have a cuddle, and it became clear that the woman had had a mastectomy. And the couple were going to be intimate with each other, and it was clear because of the way that the woman's torso was exposed that she'd had a mastectomy. And I thought, how wonderful that actually we're seeing intimacy between a husband and a wife, where actually there's been a struggle in this area.
Yes.
Because what we're shown perfection. We're usually shown people under the age of 50 with good bodies, toned, who are having sex in lots of acrobatical positions, and both are instantly aroused, often climax at the same time. And I just think it's feeding us a lie.
Yes.
And I think
they never have smelly breath either.
They don't. They don't have smelly breath. Yeah, I agree with you. And also their clothes just seem to come away. I think they must be Velcro sort of fastenings to trousers and things like that. I mean, you rarely see a scenario where somebody's having problems, getting an item of clothing off, or gets entangled, or something interrupts that process, because I guess for the viewer, they want to create a bit of fantasy.
But that's the problem, isn't it? Because that then gets in the way of expectations. So, I mean, the underlying purpose of your book is how to nurture lifelong desire and intimacy. Because although it's called Seasons of Sex and Intimacy, you're not suggesting there's a season and then as you get older, that's it, it's over and done with. This is a lifelong journey. Is the ability to realistically acknowledge the pressure of media portrayal, acknowledge the fact that we're not perfect, acknowledge the fact that it's difficult to talk, and then to go on and communicate, is that the fundamental that we need to actually nurture that lifelong experience?
Yes. I think that we have to completely change our attitude to thinking about sex, and we have to turn away from what we're being fed and portray and how it's being portrayed, and we have to be really real about it. And there's a sex therapist called Esther Perel who's written a book talking about, the book's called Mating in Captivity, and she's done quite a lot of research into when couples are most attracted to their partners. And she says something interesting in the research she's done. She says that couples say that they're most attracted to their partners when they see them out of the usual context. So it might be they go into a party and they see their partner sort of animated and talking in the corner. It might be they see them at work doing a presentation. And they're reminded of the fact that actually there were qualities that were there that really attracted to them when they were dating and when they met. And she goes on to say that we have to forget the idea of spontaneity. If we wait until all the emails are done, the house is tidy, the children are sleeping perfectly, there's nothing to do in the house, I'm feeling in the mood and rested, you're feeling in the mood and rested, the stars are aligned, then we will have sex. If we wait for that moment, it will never, ever come. And so what we have to do is we have to be really intentional. And the problem with being intentional is it suggests there's an element of work. And the reality is I do think there's now an element of work in terms of thinking about how do we keep this going? How do we keep the conversation going? How do we think about when we're most likely to be intimate together and plan for that? And that is so against what we're fed, which is, if it's right, it will just happen, and it will happen a lot, and we'll all both be in the mood. Actually, that's not true. So if we're going to change what we do, we have to really think about the elements that will help us do that. And the other thing is, and the reason that the sort of seasons came up is, I don't think sex is something that is a sort of a static thing. You do it, it's like this is how it stays. It's something that changes, and it changes because of lots of different reasons. It changes because our bodies change as we get older, and we're faced with different challenges, different illnesses. It changes because we're faced with mental health issues. It changes because we're faced with redundancy or grief of a parent or infertility. So if we can incorporate that and understand it's something we need to keep talking about, keep working, keep planning, that, I think, can hugely revolutionise how a couple view sex for all of their life together.
And Emma's book is called Seasons of Sex and Intimacy. It's available online. You can also find out more about it by going to her own website, emmawaring.com. The thing is, Emma, the marriage service says that sex is for comfort and procreation of children, which is all very worthy and so on and so forth. But it is okay that it can just be fun. In fact, important that it just be fun as well.
Yes, definitely. And in the Church of England marriage service, it says the gift of marriage brings husband and wife together in the delight and tenderness of sexual union and a joyful commitment to the end of their lives. And I really believe that God has given us sex and intimacy, this level of intimacy with our partner, because I think it really bonds us and really energizes us. And I don't think he created it to be a chore and something that we sort of had to grit our teeth and just do because we feel we have to do it. I believe that he designed it so that it would be something that would be that had the potential to be really pleasurable. But again, something that as a couple you perhaps need to work at. It's not necessarily going to be something where it's easy, and there may be times where it is more difficult.
We're back to those movies again, aren't we, really? And the way that it is portrayed. And I suppose there is also in that, and again, it's one of the things that you highlight, but there is that sort of, that biblical principle of preferring one another, caring about the other person's experience, caring about how things work for the other person, that actually is essential if long-term the relationship is going to flourish, is going to be fun, and is going to be joyful.
Yes, I mean, the truth is you're much more likely to keep doing something if you enjoy it. If it's really difficult and there are problems and you're not able to tackle those or talk about them, then it's often the preferable alternative is just to bury your head in the sand and think, well, at some point this will sort itself out. And I often find that in the couples that I work with. They come to the clinic and they've been struggling usually for at least a year, if not a couple of years. And when we've talked about that, they've said it was just really difficult to talk about it. Neither of us did. We got into the habit of not having it, not addressing it, hoping that at some point it would just sort itself out. Maybe if we went on a holiday or we went away for the weekend, and it didn't sort itself out, and then it made it worse, and then we didn't know what to say, and then we just stopped talking about it, or perhaps they'd never started talking about it, and then they eventually find their way to me.
And you make the point, as we said earlier, you make the point of the importance of conversation, but the second part of your book is all about when things go wrong, when there are problems, when there are issues. And I would imagine that when there are problems, that's where, even if communications have been good prior to that, they can very easily fall down because, all right, sweeping generalizations, I realize, but few men are going to easily admit that they have a problem. No, I'm just tired. I'm stressed at work. I'm just tired, dear. It's all right. And equally, a lot of women are inclined towards assuming that they are the problem. Oh, well, he doesn't fancy me anymore, you see. It's because I've put on weight or whatever. And who can blame him when you look at the models on the TV or whatever? Those sorts of thoughts are very, very powerful to stop us talking to each other.
Yes, when this was particularly apparent to me when I started running the erectile dysfunction clinic. And what happened was I was seeing couples come through, or often men on their own, and they would say they'd been struggling perhaps with their erections for 2 or 3 years. And when I said, well, what conversation have you had with your wife? They would say, well, I haven't, because what happened was we tried to have sex and I lost my erection, and that happened, 2 or 3 times. And then I started to panic, and the more I panicked about it, the worse it got. And then I just started to say, you go up to bed early, I want to finish watching this film. And then I would go to bed, an hour or 2 hours afterwards. And then I stopped touching her or hugging her because I felt worried that she would initiate intimacy and I would lose my erection and I wouldn't know where to go with that. And so often if I met the wife, she would say, I would lie up in bed thinking he's having an affair. He doesn't desire me. He hasn't touched me for weeks. He's not approached me sexually. Clearly, he's got somebody else. And it was desperately sad. There was so much miscommunication or no communication that was happening. And so one of the things that I talk about in the book is if we accept that probably all of us at some point in our life will face some sort of challenge that is likely to impact how we feel sexually. So women will go through the menopause. All women will go through the menopause. And we know that is a time where things change often for the women. It's really important that we don't wait until we're in a situation where we're stuck and things are really difficult, but we preempt that. We talk about it before it happens. We talk about how are we going to handle this if suddenly I don't want to have sex anymore? Or, if, for example, a couple are having sex and it's painful for the woman, rather than her just internalising that and thinking, I won't say anything, hopefully it will get better next time, to actually say, I don't know why, but that was really sore tonight, and I just think we need to keep an eye on it, because obviously if it continues, I'm going to need to go to the GP. If a man is struggling to get or keep an erection, rather than, again, internalising that fear, to say, I don't really know what's going on for me, but I've noticed the last couple of times we've made love, I've really found it difficult to maintain my erection, and I'm starting to worry that there's something going on for me. And it's incredible that once you actually do that, it becomes a couple issue. You don't have the burden of holding that yourself.
Of course, the reaction has to be appropriate as well, doesn't it? But you ensure that by having these sorts of conversations, by making them a regular thing. When things are working well, you have the conversations around that sort of stuff. It then is easier to have a more natural and secure conversation if things start to go wrong. When does an issue become a problem? Because some of these things, as you say, they will be short-term issues. Stress at work and so on can impact libido. But when does it become a problem that needs to be addressed?
Well, I try and even think of it as being a difficulty rather than a problem, or a challenge rather than a problem. Because with a problem, there's a sort of negative connotation with that. And in some ways,
there's a sort of overtone of blame or guilt, isn't there?
Yeah, and I sort of think that if we recognise that we're likely to face these challenges, we can work at that. We can talk about how we're going to address them. We can, as I said, sort of preempt them. And as you were saying, this level of communication, if you can get good at talking about all aspects of your life and your relationship together, and be really open with each other and share how you're feeling, then it makes it so much easier when you do come across something that's challenging. And I would say that something becomes a problem when somebody is stuck. And it's amazing, isn't it? If you have a challenge and then you formulate a plan often it loses its heaviness. It doesn't mean that it's gone away overnight. The example I gave you of the sexual pain, for example, for a woman, if she has sexual intercourse and it's really painful, it doesn't mean to say that she's not going to go on and the next time it won't be painful. But if she shared that with her husband and he knows that it was difficult, it might be that the next time they're intimate together and perhaps they attempt intercourse, she can then say, actually, it's really sore again. I don't want to have intercourse tonight. Each couple will have their own language, but she might say, I don't want to have penetrative intercourse tonight, or the equivalent of, in terms of how they express that to each other. Can we do something else? So the great thing about that is the couple, they found a way to manage that difficulty in that moment, but it doesn't mean that they have to stop being intimate. It doesn't mean that they have to stop being close. And one of the things that I think is terribly sad with couples that I work with is what often happens is one or other is struggling with a problem. They're intimate together. Some aspect of it doesn't work. And what they do is they end up turning their backs on each other and going to sleep, having not discussed it, and lying there with lots of internal dialogue about he doesn't fancy me, or, all sorts of things. The other thing that can happen, which I think again can be really damaging, is that one person can go off and can be masturbating and having a sort of sex life on their own because they don't know how to have this conversation, so they don't have it. They bury their heads in the sand. They get their sexual needs met by stimulating themselves, and then there's this big void within the relationship where neither of them are discussing it, and that I think is when something can become a problem because there's no plan.
And I suppose it is that idea to become one flesh and actually recognizing that all these things are shared joys and shared issues, shared challenges. It's recognizing that we're in it together and we work through these things together, and of course can get help together. But I mean, as good British Christians, of course, surely all we need to do is pray and all will be well. Is it really? He says, asking the sex therapist, do we need to sometimes get help? How do we decide when that is?
I think we do. I think that there are some wonderful resources out there, and there are some things that couples can do for themselves that can hugely improve the intimacy together. And I think we need to take responsibility for that as a couple. And if we've committed to ensuring that we have a lifelong relationship that includes intimacy, then we both have to agree to be prepared to tackle things as a couple, talk about them as a couple, and work out a plan. And I think that if as a Christian we're saying, well, all we need to do is pray about it, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't pray about it. I think that's a great place to start. And I also think if that's all we say, that's another way of burying our head in the sand.
Yes.
I think we need to do both. We need to pray, and we need to talk as a couple, and we need to think about getting some practical help.
Emma's book is called Seasons of Sex and Intimacy. It's available online. You can find out more by going to her website, which, as I said earlier, is emmawaring.com. Once you've worked your way through the book, and the second half of the book looks at the issues that can be problems, can be the challenges to overcome, to quote Emma from earlier, there's also a few appendices. And I noticed, Emma, that one of the appendices carries some thoughts about, well, what are sometimes referred to as adult toys and are sometimes referred to as marital aids. And I wonder if actually, especially within the context of a Christian marriage, where we're not always entirely sure as to how much fun sex is supposed to be, whether marital aids and toys, sometimes their worth, their value is a bit undermined by our insecurity about this.
Yes, I really agree with that. And I think that we need to talk with our partner about how they feel about these things. How do they feel about introducing something like a vibrator? And the way that I often position it when I'm working with a couple, if there's hesitation there, It won't necessarily be a Christian couple. It could be a couple with another faith, or actually just a sense that we should be able to do this without the need for, bringing something else in. If I was good enough, then, my wife wouldn't need this, that kind of thing. So what I'll say to people is, look, for some couples or for some individuals, in order to improve their eyesight, they need glasses. For some people, in order to find hearing, easier, they need a hearing aid. And actually, I just see it as an extension of this. For what often happens, one of the biggest reasons that couples can run into difficulties is because of what we call performance anxiety. So I mentioned it earlier when I said if a man's worrying about will I get an erection, then he's already started a cycle of thinking, I mustn't think about this, I mustn't dwell on it because otherwise I'll lose my erection. And even having those thoughts then impacts his ability to get an erection. The same thing can happen with a woman. So if the couple are having foreplay, and we know that women must be adequately aroused, otherwise penetration can be really uncomfortable. If a couple are having foreplay, but actually the woman is struggling to become aroused, it can be really difficult. It can be another version of performance anxiety. I mustn't think about this. I'm sure if I concentrate enough, I'll enjoy it, or I don't like it, or that was a bit uncomfortable, or that's not doing it for me. And again, you've got that sort of negative cycle. And the wonderful thing about something like using a vibrator is, and in my book, I suggest that the couple use this together, so it feels very much like a couple aid. That actually it can bypass that in a similar way that drugs for erectile dysfunction can just get the man over the confidence hurdle of will I, won't I lose my erection, or I haven't lost it, that's great, and the confidence is built upon. The same thing happens for a woman, and if she suddenly thinks, actually that feels really nice, and her husband's lying next to her, he's enjoying the fact that she's feeling aroused, and then the couple perhaps go on and have intercourse, and both really enjoy that. I think that's got to be a good thing.
I suppose there has to be a line we draw, though, does there? Because there is an awful lot of stuff that is available to people now, and that has been glamorized by TV and films and so on, that actually, I mean, is there, within a marriage, is there a line that we should not cross?
Well, one of the things that I felt personally for me when I wrote this book was that I didn't want to be prescriptive. And the reason that I felt that this was important was because what is right for one married couple won't necessarily be right for another. And actually, at the heart of it is the coming back to the art of communication. And one of the things that we have to do as part of the couple is we have to navigate our way through what do we want our sexual relationship to look like and feel like? How often do we want to make love? When is that most likely to happen? Do we include oral sex? Do we include sex aids? All those kind of things. And actually, I didn't feel it would be helpful. I think some Christians want this, but I didn't feel it would be helpful for the style of my book to say, I think that this is right or this is wrong. What I do say is that I do believe that sexual acts should be, well, first of all, they must be consensual. Both parties must agree and go into doing whatever they're doing willingly without any sort of fear of coercion or pressure. I think they should be respectful. And I think that they should draw the couple together. Now, for some couples, that will mean using a sex aid, and for another couple, it won't include that. For some couples, it may include oral sex. For other couples, it won't. So I think at the heart of this, we come back to the ability of the couple to be very open and honest and frank with each other about what their sexual repertoire may or may not include.
There is a danger there, though, isn't there? Because history is full of examples where in a couple, one has pressured the other and the other has felt, even if it's not overt pressure, has felt the need to respond and do things that they weren't comfortable with in order to please, in order to love, in order to be faithful, so on and so forth.
Yes. I agree with that. I think what's also interesting, though, is sometimes I've worked with couples where one person, for example, has said, I would like to try oral sex and we never have. And the other person has said, I don't agree with it. I don't think it's right. And they sort of made a unilateral decision that this is what's going to happen. They don't feel it's right. And there's not even a place to hear the other person's viewpoint. And it might be after a period of discussion and revisiting it and talking about what lies behind the idea this is something the person doesn't want to do, that actually the couple decide this isn't going to be part of their sexual repertoire. But it is so important that each person is respected and that they do feel there's a place to share what they would like to include in their own sex life within this marriage. So I think it's important that we are able to listen to what our partner is saying, and it's not necessarily a conversation that you're going to agree everything in one go. It might be something that you revisit. But I think the most important thing is that we are respectful and we listen. And also, the other thing I think is really important is we must be prepared to challenge ourselves as well. So, for example, let's imagine that you've got a couple and she's really struggling to get aroused. The husband is doing everything that he can, but it's not working. It means that having intercourse is really painful. He reads an article, perhaps he reads my book and says, do you know what, why don't we try a sex aid? Because actually it may be really helpful. And she says, no, I don't agree with it. I think she needs to be able to challenge herself as to, well, why don't I agree with it? Well, perhaps I don't agree with it because I grew up in a very stifled family where sex was always talked about in a shameful way. And in fact, sex was only really allowed when you were trying to have a baby. So the idea that I could move from a value set, which is about sex or being about procreation, to sex is for pleasure, and I introduce something to heighten that, can be a big step for somebody to get to. But if we're prepared to challenge ourselves and some of these tightly held views that we have, that again can be a really liberating process for the couple to go through. And I see that a lot with the couples I work with.
You, of course, do make clear in your book, you're talking about married couples and the very fact that you have a section which is talking about nurturing lifelong desire and intimacy. It's obviously couples that are together, married for the long haul, as it were. That we also live in a world, though, where experience of sex is more and more something that people have had. If they weren't quite promiscuous, they've probably had a couple of partners and so on. What difference does that make if you're bringing that history into a relationship rather than perhaps as it might have been for my generation, perhaps, where you're bringing in the history where we've only ever known each other?
Yeah. I think it does bring its own challenges, and I think it can be particularly difficult if I'm working with a couple where one person has had past sexual experiences and partners and the other person hasn't. That can be quite challenging, and I recognise I keep coming back to communication. But I think that the couple need to talk about this. And I often get asked, well, do you think that couples should share their past sexual experiences with the other person? And I do, but I think one has to be very, very sensitive in terms of the level of detail. I don't think it's particularly helpful to go into huge amounts of detail about what somebody enjoyed with another partner and this worked and this didn't. I don't think that's helpful, and I think that can create insecurities.
And be a bit selfish as well, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that before if you're thinking about a couple perhaps that are getting married and they're waiting until they get married to have sex, but potentially they've had a history where they've had other partners, I think it's really important to sort of set the scene and to talk about, actually, this is what's happened before I met you, and I had these relationships, and what I would like for our relationship going forward is this, and what have you. So I think there is a place for sharing, but I think it must be sensitively done.
Because it would have a great potential to sow lifelong insecurities, that wouldn't it? Yes.
I in my book in my chapter on communication, I talk about a model called transactional analysis, and I won't go into the detail of that now, but it's a wonderful model to use, and I talk about the importance of having these discussions from what's called your adult ego state, which is it's coming from a position where perhaps you lay aside preconceived ideas. It may be, so for example, if a couple are talking and one person is really struggling with feelings of jealousy, rather than harbour those and build up resentment, there is a place, if we come from adult, to say, I really understand why you've shared this, and I think it's important we talk about our past sexual relationships. It's really interesting what it's bringing up for me. I'm finding it really painful, or I'm feeling terribly jealous, and I realise that that's not rational because that was 10 years ago, and we hadn't even met. But actually, I'm finding it really difficult to hear. And then the partner can come back and say, I'm sorry that you feel that way. What do you want to do with that? Do you think this conversation is helpful? Do you want to stop? What do you need from me? And that, again, can be a hugely bonding experience if we're really honest about what's going on internally for us. And if we're sharing our histories, it's bound to bring up stuff that for ourselves and the other person may be very painful.
We said right at the beginning of this conversation, Emma, that it's really difficult for most people to talk about sex, to talk about intimacy, perhaps particularly within the context of Christian faith because of some of the worries and the fears about sin and lust and so on and so forth. Is there something the church can do, not just for our own community, but perhaps also for a world that seems so impacted by hypersexualized images and ideas and conversations and songs and so on? Is there something we can do to encourage people to embrace the right sort of communication about this that will actually build not only couples, but also build communities?
Yes, definitely. I'm involved with a course called the Marriage Course and the Marriage Preparation Course, which is a course that I'm sure you're familiar with, and it runs out of various churches around the UK and, in fact, around the world. It was set up by Nikki and Scylla Lee. And one of the things that I think is fantastic in that course is that communication is right at the heart of it. And it's run over about 8 sessions, and the couple goes along and they will usually have a meal, and then they'll watch a DVD which will cover various aspects of marriage. 1 week is about sex. But the couple has time on their own to talk about these things. And I went to an event recently where Nikki and Scylla were being interviewed. They've been married for many years, and they were being interviewed about their relationship. And another couple was also being interviewed about their relationship. And it was just so wonderful. It was so refreshing because what they did was they said from the stage, actually, we really struggle with this. And early on in our marriage, and it wasn't about sex, but it was, we really struggled with how to manage our finances, and one person did it this way and one person that way, and it's been a real struggle. And another couple said, actually, what I'm finding really difficult at this phase in our life is this aspect. So what was wonderful was they weren't on the stage portraying something that was easy. They were saying, this is really hard work, and actually you have to keep working at it. And in life, in society, we have kind of an instant culture, don't we, where we get things just when we click our fingers. You know, we order something, it arrives the next day. We send a message, somebody responds within a minute. It's instant. And I think what I loved was the authenticity that came from these two couples that shared. It was completely different from a film. They was talking about their relationship, about real life, about how it was for them. And I absolutely know, certainly for myself, and I'm sure for those other couples in the audience watching, I could connect to them. And I thought, yeah, this is what it's about. We all face similar struggles. Communication isn't easy. It's difficult. It's a work in progress. I believe marriage, I believe sexual intimacy is a work in progress that we do throughout our lives. We don't get to a point where it's finished. A little bit like a garden. It can look beautiful one day, and the next day there's a weed in it, or the next day you need to fertilize it, the next day you need to water it, then you sit in it and enjoy it, and then the next day you need to mow the lawn. Keep a garden beautiful requires work, and sometimes we can sit and enjoy the labours of that work, and other times we have to put the work in to get to that stage. And I think marriage is like that. And I think if we can model that, leaders can model that within the church. We run courses that equip couples to be able to put in that work and recognise that's going to be part of their life's journey together. I think that's the answer.
Well, Emma's book is called Seasons of Sex and Intimacy by Emma Waring. Find out more by going to her website, which is emmawaring.com, and find the book online at the moment, also hopefully soon in good bookshops. And perhaps it is the case that we need to recognise that more of us than we might imagine have been blighted by that media image of relationships as well as intimacy and sex, that we think it must all be perfect. Otherwise, there's something fundamentally wrong with us, when actually it's more like that garden that if it's tended and worked can be a tremendous place to enjoy, but we do have to recognise the responsibility to care for it. Emma, lovely to speak to you today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.